Hello everybody and welcome back to another Marvel Crisis Protocol character spotlight, and today we are taking a look at Bob, Agent of Hydra. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into things here. So Bob is coming in as a 2-2-2 defensively, so probably one of, if not the worst defensive line in the game. He's got 3 stamina, so really supporting that even more, and is a 2 threat. So yeah, I would kind of hope so with victim stats like those. He's a size 2 and a medium mover, so not off to a super strong start for our friend Bob here. Moving on from his stats though, let's take a look at the things that he does. So the first thing is his Hydra pistol attack. This is going to be a range 3 4 dice physical attack, and it's going to gain you 1 power. So just your kind of standard gainer there, nothing too special. Notably, it's a range 3 one, so that's kind of nice. You do get a little bit of range out of that. But yeah, nothing really to write home about here. The next one, however, is his, I don't know if we can really call this a spender because it costs 0 power, and at the beginning of this, it's going to sound like the most amazing attack you've ever seen. It's called Excessive Violence. This is a range 4 9 dice physical attack that costs you 0 power. However, you may choose this attack only if you have a loaded token. After the attack is resolved, you lose all loaded tokens that you have. So that is a thing, and that's actually been errated. So it's actually during the pay power cost step of the attack because of a thing you used to be able to do with the timing that obviously was not the intention. And we'll get to that in a moment as well. But it has a couple other things on it as well, in addition to being a 9 dice attack. Before damage is dealt, all other characters within range 2 of the target character are going to suffer 2 damage. So yeah, that's really good. There's no wild even for that. You're just going to hit anyone near them for 2 flat damage. Really good. Probably the best explosive trigger in the game, and it's not even a trigger, and it's before damage, so if you take out the target, you still get to do it. Fantastic. After this attack is resolved, this character is thrown away from the target character small. This throw is resolved by the player controlling the target character, so your opponent's going to get to throw you away from their target small. Then, if this character does not have a dazed token, it suffers 3 damage. So if you're not already dazed, you're going to knock yourself out on this attack. And this is where the kind of errata timing came in here, is that if you chose to knock yourself out first because they're both after the attack is resolved, you couldn't lose the loaded token, which is kind of important to how this model is balanced because that would allow you to do the 9 dicer every single turn, which is kind of ridiculous because that loaded token is a very kind of integral part of his kit here. Before we get back to loaded token things, though, we are going to take a look at his other superpower here he has, which is Hydra Tactics. This is a 2 cost. Choose another allied character within range 2 of this character. Place this character within range 1 of the chosen character. So I believe this is exactly the same as I want to say Winter Soldier 1's Hydra Tactics ability, which is actually a really solid ability. I mean, it costs him 2 power, and he does only have that gainer there. And since he's knocking himself out, he's not even gaining power for taking that damage. So you do have to kind of be careful about that. But otherwise, this is great. This allows you to get in range to do your thing more often. For excessive violence, it'll allow you to make sure you got a good shot lined up. But outside of that, it can just allow you to be in a better position to, let's say, double tap with your Hydra pistol. So yeah, it's solid for that. It does cost you the same amount of power you can potentially gain from your Hydra pistol, so you kind of go net even, but still not a bad option to have. Next, he has the Make It Spicy Bob superpower. This is an 8 cost active superpower, and it's going to take one of your actions, but you're going to gain that loaded token back. So this is how you reload the rocket launcher to perform excessive violence again. Obviously really important, but costing you 8 power means, even if you're using your gainer every turn and you're not spending on Hydra Tactics or anything else, this is going to take you a while. It's not that easy to reload here, so definitely something to consider. The last superpower he has here is My Caliente, and all that does is give you one loaded token at the start of the game. So this is only going to happen once, but you get to start the game with the rocket. So you're coming in as a 2-threat, and you might only get to fire it once, but you're throwing this attack at least once. So yeah, that is it for his front side, but Bob is one of the characters that does undergo some changes when you flip him over. For the most part, everything stays the same. He still has those victim stats. He's still only 3 stamina, so he is going to die very, very easily. But in the event that he does die, he has one of my favorite superpowers in the game. But how? If this character does not have an activated token and would be KO'd by having damage tokens placed on it, it gains a dazed token instead. During the cleanup phase, when you would normally flip this character's stat card as a result of a dazed token, it remains on its injured side and he loses 3 power. If at any time this is the only character you control, you lose the game. This ability is kind of what makes Bob interesting, other than the fact that he's just a model that gets to loose a 9 dice explosive for 2 attack at least once in the game. This makes it so he is really awkward for your opponent to try and actually remove from the table. You're always pretty much safe to go with him at the end of the round because they could deny his activation, but they won't take him off the board. So, you know, as long as he hasn't activated yet, you get to save him till the end and then do whatever he needs to do, whether that's double Hydra pistol, maybe he can finally reload and launch that rocket. Whatever he's trying to do, he is going to either get a chance to do it or if he is punished for waiting, he's at least not going to be taken off the board. So that's kind of damage they could have put into a different character that would have been actually removable. So yeah, it's a really interesting power. It does work out with the timing because you don't gain your activated token until the end of your activation. If you kill yourself with excessive violence here, you do get the or you do get this effect where you get to basically stay alive, but you're going to lose 3 power. The losing 3 power part does kind of suck if you knock yourself out with excessive violence because that part is friendly damage, so you don't gain the 3 power for having taken 3 damage. So you're just losing for that, so it's making it harder for you to get back to that loaded token again. But something you just kind of got to keep in mind on this side of his card is that if you do want to have a chance at throwing that attack out again, you're going to have to be somewhat mindful with your power. So overall, is Bob the strongest 2-threat in the game? Definitely not. But he is a lot of fun, and he can definitely catch an opponent off guard if they're not expecting him and they don't really have a plan for what to do when they just take a 9 dice rocket to the face, followed by that area attack. This can be a really interesting way to just kind of very early in the game be like, hey, that model there, I'm threatening the KO on them for the rest of the game. So yeah, he's creates some really interesting questions for your opponent to try and answer, and I do really like him for that reason. He can definitely backfire on you. I totally had a game where I launched this at Loki round 1. Loki woke back up and was now like, okay, well, I'm turning off all of your crits this early in the game, and I've got all this power. You're never going to be able to hit me and all that stuff. Was absolutely brutal. So you got to pick your targets carefully. Definitely not my finest moment, but still, it can definitely throw a wrench in a lot of people's plans, and I think it makes him a really, really interesting character. As far as tactics cards are concerned, he does have a tactics card here. It is Yoink. So this is one that is actually a Deadpool card. Deadpool plays it during his activation, and basically he gets one of these effects based on if he has an enemy or an ally, and this one's a little bit funny because it actually doesn't work if you are the one playing Deadpool. It only works if your opponent is playing Deadpool, and they basically get to take his loaded token away, which is kind of rude. So yeah, Bob doesn't really have a tactics card. It's actually one that gets used against him. So sad times for Bob, but I guess that is what it is. He is a member of 2 different affiliations here, those being Cabal and Hydra. He's the second 2-threat in Cabal, so we'll go ahead and start out there, where it is always interesting having access to 2 2-threats. does allow you to go really, really wide if you want to, while still bringing some very qualitative models. And even splashes and things like that. It's one of the advantages that Guardians has, and part of why they're able to get away with going so wide sometimes. In this case, I don't think Bob is as good as either of the Guardians' two threats, just as a kind of general use case thing, but I still think it's nice that he kind of gives you that possibility and really opens up the room for splashing and things like that, especially since some of the leaderships in Cabal are really, really good. Speaking of leaderships, I do think he actually plays really nicely into a couple of the leaderships. Mostly, I'm thinking of Malekith here when I think of Bob, and the reason for that is Malekith's whole thing is about dazing or KOing enemy characters. So being able to kind of start the game out and be like, hey, that model is relatively squishy. There are a pretty decent chance that that just goes down to a 9 dice rocket from range 4. So let's just have Bob walk up, throw a rocket at that, let's say 5 health model that is, you got to be able to get within range 4 of them. So it's not always going to be something you can do. But if your opponent's not ready for it, again, that whole kind of he's not an expected pick. So people aren't really used to what he does. Knocking something out with that rocket and then being like, okay, well, Malekith is going to get a short advance. He's going to gain a power, and now suddenly he's got his ferocity online. He's got all that stuff going. Absolutely brutal. So yeah, I think he's a really interesting piece with Malekith, and kind of compiling onto that, being a 7-threat leader, having a 2-threat as your next affiliated model is kind of a nice starting ground for keeping your threat, relatively reasonable and still having a decent model count. So yeah, I really, really like him there. I'm a little bit more hesitant with something like Red Skull 3, just because you lose power for using the leadership, so he's not going to get too much out of it, and the odds of him being able to ever reload that rocket are not looking too good there. So not a huge fan there, although it is nice if you really want to make that rocket super impactful the first time, just kind of being like, okay, we're going to launch this rocket, and then, oh no, I'm going to take a damage at the end of this? Well, too bad, I'm knocking myself out instead, so you have something like that as well. Red Skull 1, however, I think is really interesting for him, being able to gain extra power off those gainers, heck, being able to gain a power back from your pistol shot, or your rocket shot, rather. So, starting out the next round on at least 2 power, let's say, even if you launch it round 1, is pretty solid. Or I guess 3 power? Yeah, that's how that would work, because you'd have 2 power phases at that point. So, that's a nice place to start, and then those pistols potentially gaining you 2 if they do any damage. They're only 4 dicers, but still you're still expecting to get damage at least a good amount of the time, maybe not all of the time, but so yeah, that feels pretty solid there. Unfortunately, Sins, while not being an amazing leadership to begin with, is also not great for him, because he's not really a great objective piece, seeing as he's playing most of the game on his injured side, and he's probably going down pretty often, so he's not really going to get to take too much of an advantage from these sorts of things here, but still definitely an option you could choose to do. Taking a look at his other affiliation, he is affiliated Hydra, where you're going to have access to many of the same models. And one thing I didn't mention in Cabal, but it also holds true in Hydra, is he does appreciate some of the models like Zemo, Strucker, or even Zola, being able to give him some rerolls and get a little bit of extra consistency on that rocket. Definitely feels really, really bad when the rocket does whiff. So something like Zola particularly is actually quite interesting there, because usually you get kind of some downsides if you're rolling skulls and stuff like that. But again, he's knocking himself out anyways, so why does he care? So yeah, something like that could be kind of interesting. I'd also be curious to see Zola's card played on him and what that might do. That would be kind of interesting to give him something else he can do other than the rocket. So something like that could be kind of neat. As far as leaderships go, he doesn't bring in any tactics cards, so he doesn't care particularly for Zemo's leadership. Strucker's leadership, he's not applying any conditions, and even if he was, the healing isn't that great for him, so not really his favorite thing, but he does appreciate the reroll. And then you've got Red Skull, Master of Hydra, which is actually a really good leadership for him. I mean, just being able to very consistently gain an extra power every round is pretty solid. So yeah, this is probably his favorite Hydra leadership by a fair bit. That said, you're not really bringing him because he's benefiting from your leadership most of the time, unless, you have a specific plan like with Malekith or something like that. But a lot of the time, if you're bringing him in one of the places he's affiliated, it's because A, he's affiliated, and B, because you get to throw that rocket at someone. And, on top of being potentially really surprising and kind of setting a tone for the game, it can also just be a lot of fun to throw a big dice pool of 9 dice. So, sometimes he's just a fun model to bring. Now, when it comes to splashing Bob, I think the big thing you're kind of looking at for Bob is you really want to be able to get that rocket online as much as possible. Again, outside of having a very specific use case where you need that early days on something, which he is pretty solid at doing. But yeah, so I think there's a few interesting places. I mean, A-Force personally, I think is really, really interesting for him. Throw them into A-Force, and now every time they punch anyone on your list that's not Bob, you're going to power up Bob. You're going to get that rocket online pretty frequently, I think. Meanwhile, if they go out of their way to punch Bob, you're going to power up somebody else on your team, and they've wasted, an attack or two into Bob, so that feels great as well. So yeah, I actually really like the idea of him in A-Force and might have to try that out at some point because that does sound really cool. There's some other ones like Steve 1 in Avengers could be kind of interesting. It makes it a little bit cheaper. You can even benefit on Hydra tactics there. It's not too bad, but personally, I don't think that's quite enough to really justify splashing him there. So not really my go-to of choice. I think some of the other ones that could be interesting if you really want to funnel power into them would be something like Inhumans. Go under Black Bolt there, funnel a bunch of power into them using the leadership just from some of your models that can kind of soak up power a little bit more, like Lockjaw and those types of models. So you could kind of get something interesting going with that. That's definitely something you can play with. But yeah, I think those are kind of my two favorite places to to put them. And it's kind of funny because I hadn't even really thought about A-Force when I started recording this video. My first thought was Inhumans, but I'm actually coming around on A-Force, and maybe I like that even more. But yeah, those are kind of my favorite ones. You could probably funnel a lot of power into him in something like X-Men as well, under Cyclops or Xavier. He won't really give back in Xavier as much, unfortunately. I mean, when he does choose to do the reload, that'll be helpful, but again, you probably don't want to be doing the Hydra tactics too often, so you got to be kind of mindful of something like that. So yeah, that's not the best for him. Something like Legion of the Lost, same deal. He's just not going to be. Or is Legion? Oh no, Legion of the Lost is Mephisto. I keep mixing up this one and the Dracula one. They're both too new. But no, Legion of the Lost is unfortunately one of those ones where I don't think it's great for him because you're only able to kind of power up a couple models, and how often are you going to want to pick Bob for that one? I'm not so sure because you're going to have to pick him multiple times to really funnel him up to the levels you want. Um, Meanwhile, with something like Inhumans, you're bringing battery models anyways, and you're already planning to distribute power, so you basically just throw one his way whenever you don't have a plan for what to do with some of that power. So personally, I think that's kind of the difference there. And then yeah, like something like Dracula, he's not getting much out of either. Emma's could be kind of interesting in that regard, where you get the extra power for contesting points. That is something you can kind of play around with, but I don't think that's going to be better than say Inhumans or A-Force for that. So yeah, I think I'm really sticking with those two. Dark Dimension actually could be really interesting. I don't hate that. He's gonna start pinging himself for damage, but like he really doesn't care too much about that, so that's not too bad. Yeah, actually, Dark Dimension might be my next pick. So those ones are probably the best ones. But yeah, really anywhere you can just funnel power. I'm sure I'm missing one or two because there's so many power-based leaderships in the game. But that's kind of what he's looking for. A little bit of dice consistency here and there from some of the other models doesn't hurt, but you don't really want to be committing it to him. He is only a 2 threat, so kind of keep that in mind when deciding where to put him. He's usually not worth being the center point of a list, more just kind of something, a little something extra you have there just to make things interesting at the start of the game, really. But yeah, I think that's just about going to do it for my thoughts on Mr. Bob here, Robert Dobolina, or Dobolina. I'm not 100% sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think Bob is a really fun character. I've put him on the table a few times myself, and no matter what happens with him, he's always fun. I've had him blow up a few models with that rocket, and it feels great. Sometimes it does whiff. That is the nature of big dice attacks. Sometimes it happens. But you've got stuff for like the area 2 damage, which is actually really consistent if you want to kind of use that in a more consistent, more competitive competitive way. There are definitely ways to do that. But yeah, at the end of the day, is Bob winning, topping any two threat competitive charts? Probably not, but I do think he's a really fun model that can also really throw a fork in your opponent's plans, just kind of being able to say like, hey, here is a 9 dicer you're dealing with, and if this roll goes well, can you deal with your 4 or 5 threat model getting spiked down round one? No? All right. Well, that's good for me, I guess, right? So, yeah, I really, really like Bob, and I think he does something really, really interesting. But, at the end of the day, probably not the most competitive pick in the world. But I'm very curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are. Are there any synergies or anything like that that I missed? Are there any just kind of like, ways to use him that I didn't really talk about here? Very, very curious to hear what you guys think. But as far as my thoughts on the character goes, that is going to be it for this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please do drop a like down below. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. We do discussion-focused content like this throughout the weekdays, and we have battle reports on the weekends. So if you're a fan of any of that sort of thing, feel free to jump on in. But that's going to do it for now. So until next time, have a great day, everybody. Peace.